We will now begin Federal Government Unit 2, which will include public opinion, political socialization, political parties, and interest groups. Let's first talk about public opinion. Public opinion, let's get a definition. Public opinion is the collected attitudes of citizens concerning a given issue or question. The key word here is collected. Collected attitudes. It's not Public opinion is not necessarily concerned with the opinion of one person. What they do is they cumulatively put together all the opinions of individual persons and create a, a general idea of what the public as a whole thinks. And this is very important for politicians and political scientists and sociologists and people that study society and what society wants and needs. So public opinion is important, especially for politics. Now, opinion is often varied when it comes to public opinion. You can have extremes on both ends. You can have, uh, very, very divergent opinions on whatever issue it might be. And a lot of, and the problem is, a lot of the opinions people have, it's based on either bad knowledge or lack of knowledge. That often is because of that's why the opinions are varied so much. People's knowledge is different of an issue than other people's. Somebody that is well informed on an issue may have one opinion on that issue. Those that are not as well informed or have uh, bad information or wrong information and shape their opinion based on that are going to have a different opinion. Uh, Many people are uninformed. The information they get regarding an issue is simply wrong. And I know it from my personal experience and probably from most of your personal experiences. Oftentimes you get bad information from people you trust. I know I look back at some of the things my parents told me as a child growing up, just about life in general, and it was generally wrong. They were trying to protect me by telling me things were a certain way, uh, but once I faced real life, I realized that what my parents were telling me were wrong, and I feel like today, as an adult now, that they did a disservice by not telling me the truth. But I understand that they were trying to protect me by um, telling me, misinforming me in order to shape me, I guess, if you will. Uh, but people are uninformed, people are misinformed. So that where the key to whether you have a valid opinion and what your opinion might be, a lot of it has to do with where you get your information. And you can get bad information from, like I said, your parents, your peers, your family. You can also get bad information from the media. The media is notorious for skewering and, uh, uh, and not being objective with their information and news reporting because they have an agenda, either a political agenda or some other type of agenda, in order to persuade you to believe one way or another. So we must be diligent in ensuring that the information we get is valid. Characteristics of public opinion. Some things to think about when we talk about this. Public attitudes can vary over time, often dramatically. Uh, One of the most historically consistent uh, issues on which people's attitudes change over time is war. Uh, Generally, at the beginning of any war that the United States fights, public opinion is strongly in favor of the war. Of course, there's reasons for that. No lives have been lost yet. No money has been spent, and the government is using all of its resources to promote through the media the necessity of the war. So people buy into it. We become patriotic. We are supportive of the effort. But as wars progress, as they inevitably do, and they last longer and longer, years and oftentimes decades, such as the Afghanistan war, public opinion changes. People do not support the war as much. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially the war in Afghanistan, was generally very popular when it began in 2000, and I guess that would be 2002, late 2001. But Now, most people are not in support of that war in Afghanistan, and they'd argue it's time for us to get out. They feel like it is not worth the blood and the treasure. That's a great example of how over time public opinion can change. Uh, Public opinion may place boundaries on policy. Um, we allow our government to kind of move across the political spectrum as it wishes, from liberal to conservative, from policy to policy, and we hold them accountable by elections. But oftentimes they'll go too far to one extreme or the other, and if public opinion becomes such that it is vehemently against whatever trajectory policy is taking, that will check them usually, and they'll rein it in because they don't want to threaten an uprising against the government and potentially a revolution. That's a civil rights movement's a good example where public opinion forced forced the federal government to place limits on states' rights to discriminate. Government often responds to public opinion. Uh, they'll listen to public opinion. It's important because, of course, the public is who elects the government officials making the policy. But government sometimes does not do what the people want, and I think we recognize that on a daily basis, that the government isn't necessarily responsive to the will of the people all the time, although it is some of the time. Now, how do we measure public opinion? How do we know what people are thinking? Uh, well, first of all, the most common way to measure public opinion is a public opinion poll. Interviews are surveys whereby a relatively small number of individuals, called the sample, are interviewed for the purpose of estimating the opinions of the population. Now, let's talk about this a minute, because I usually ask a question is, how many people do you think out of the, say 200 million adults in the United States, how many people do you think, what size of a sample do you think surveyors, interviewers would need to talk to, would need to ask the question to ensure a fairly accurate representation of what the public as a whole thinks? So what is the minimum sample size to ensure you know what 200 million Americans are thinking? Well, the answer to that, surprisingly, is small. Generally, if you can interview now you have to do the interviews properly, and you have to use a scientific method when doing the interviews and choosing the people you talk to. But if you do it scientifically, you really only need to ask about 1,200 people in order to get an accurate representation of what 200 million people think. Of course, the more people you ask, the more accurate you will be, as long as you do it scientifically. And the fewer people you ask, the less accurate you'll be. But 1,200 is about the tipping point to where you can really ensure your accuracy. Now, but when doing these public opinion polls, you will always have something called a sampling error. A sampling error. A measure of the accuracy of the public opinion poll. It is mainly a function of sample size and is usually expressed in percentage terms. So basically, you're not going to be 100% exact if you don't ask everybody. So a sampling error is a scientific formulation. Determining the sampling error is a scientific, mathematical process, statistical process by which you admit that you are not 100% accurate because you didn't ask everybody, and the sampling error tells people, well, we know that we're not exactly right, but this is the range in which we know we are right. We know we are accurate, and it is expressed in percentage terms. So let's say we have a sampling error of plus or minus 3%, and let's say we're in the public opinion survey, we did a survey on how people would vote for a presidential election. And let's say, okay, will you vote for candidate A for president or candidate B? Let's say that 47% said they would vote for candidate A and 53% said they would vote for candidate B. And there is a sampling error of plus or minus 3%. So we know it's not that 47 and 53 are not absolutely correct answers because we didn't ask everybody. But since we did our calculations scientifically and we did our statistical analysis, we know for a fact that candidate A will receive anywhere from 44% of the vote to 50% of the vote. That's 47% plus or minus 3%. 47% minus 3% is 44%. 47% plus 3% is 50%. So plus or minus 3%. Now, on the other hand, candidate B, we guessed that 53% of the people support candidate B, plus or minus 3%. That means anywhere from 50% to 56% support candidate B. So this is very important to understand. If you don't see a sampling error in a newspaper story or a television story about a public opinion poll, don't believe the public opinion poll. It wasn't done scientifically. Now, one of the most famous public opinion polls ever done was the Literary Digest poll of 1936. Literary Digest was a national magazine that had been doing predicting presidential elections through public opinion polls since 1920, and they had been accurate uh, um, every election. They had picked the winner. But 1936 rolls around, and we have Franklin Roosevelt running for re-election against a guy named Alfred Landon. And here's how the Literary Digest did their polls. They would get lists of names and addresses from people who auto registration records, people who own cars, and telephone company records. They would get this information, and they would contact these respondents through telephone records and through automobile registration records, and they'd send them information, ask them who they're planning on voting for, and ask them other questions, and then have them mail back the surveys. Well, the Literary Digest in 1936 predicted Alfred Landon would win by a landslide. Of course, we all know, in our American history classes, we've never had a President Landon. We have had a President Roosevelt 4 times. So, well, 5, if you count Teddy Roosevelt, but this is Franklin Roosevelt. But anyway, they failed miserably. What did they do wrong? Well, they did not survey all the potential voters. Their big mistake is how they chose the people to ask the question, because if you think about 1936, we're in the midst of the Great Depression. Most Americans don't have a telephone. Most Americans don't have a car. These Americans are the ones that are most likely to vote for Roosevelt. So the people that were surveyed were generally only the people that were in the middle to upper middle class economic scale, and those are the people that are most likely to vote for Landon. While Literary Digest predicted Landon would win in a landslide, in reality Roosevelt won in a landslide. One person who did get this right and did it scientifically and predicted Roosevelt to win was a guy named George Gallup, whose name is still on one of the most prestigious polling institutions in America, the Gallup poll. Here's a chart that shows the success of Gallup's predictions, and I'm always amazed by this because it's pretty doggone accurate. 1930. Okay, first the blue dots are Gallup's final pre-election prediction since the 1936 election, and then the red dots are the final percentage of votes for the winning candidates. So the blue is the actual is the prediction, and the red is the actual amount of votes. In 1936, the one that Literary Digest predicted that Landon would win. Gallup predicted Roosevelt would get about 56% of the vote. That's the blue dot. In reality, he got about 63%. But still, he predicted the correct winner. And it looks like the only one of all of these that Gallup got wrong was the Truman election, where he predicted Truman would receive, looks like 45% of the vote, but Truman won by a nose with about 51% of the vote. And then from Kennedy up through Nixon, the second Nixon election, he was on the spot. He almost got it perfectly. And then there's some gaps where he misses it and is not as successful in choosing, but for the most part it's a very impressive record of correctly predicting presidential winners. Now, in traditional public opinion polls, there are just basically three phases, or three things you have to do. And even if you wanted to do a public opinion poll for Angelina College or for your community, for Livingston, Texas, you would still go through these three phases, whether you do it locally or you do a nationwide poll. Okay, phase one or step one. Determine the content and phrasing of the question. This is vitally important because the words you use can determine and influence the answers you get. Avoid words that bring out a passion or 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 make people think they might skewer one way or the other in the way they vote. It is because you can change somebody's response by just changing the wording of the question. This is very common when doing political polling leading up to wars and whether people support wars or not. I remember I was in graduate school in I just no I was in graduate school in with the beginning of the Iraq War when it began in 2003, and I was watching a lot of news and I'd switch from channel to channel, and I'd have one channel arguing news channel arguing that in our recent public opinion poll, uh, you know 72% of the people support going to war with Iraq. And then another channel I'd switch, and they'd say in our public opinion poll, you know, only 47% of the people support going to war with Iraq. And I was like, well, something's wrong here. They're either not doing it scientifically or something else is wrong. So what I'm going to assume is that it was probably content and phrasing. For example, if you were a news organization or a polling organization and you wanted people to support the war, you might ask the question like this, whether they support the war. You might say, do you think the United States should use its moral authority to remove the evil dictator Saddam Hussein and liberate the people of Iraq? Well, um, use our moral authority? Sure, we're moral people. Remove the evil dictator Saddam Hussein and liberate or free the people of Iraq? Okay. Yeah, I support that. That's a good idea. And maybe the other polling network maybe asked a question like this, that where only 47% support it. Should the United States invade the sovereign country of Iraq to support its geopolitical agenda to control the oil fields in the Middle East? You know that that's not necessarily why historically Americans go to war, and it's more likely to create a negative response as far as whether we should go to war or not. Both are bad questions because both use words that influence somebody's opinion. The question should be, should the United States go to war with Iraq? Let people's knowledge of why and all those other issues leave that out, and let people's own knowledge uh, shape their opinion. Selecting the sample, you must have a random sample, which basically means everybody must have the same opportunity to be asked um, the question. So if you're doing a public opinion poll for Livingston, everybody in Livingston should have an equal chance of being asked the question. Nationwide, everybody should have an equal chance. If you don't have a random sample, you don't have a good poll. So if you were going to try to ask people in Livingston, um, you want to know what people in Livingston think about, a certain policy, and you stand in front of First National Bank and ask people questions about it, you know, if that's the only place you ask people questions, that's not a good poll because it's not a random sample, because all you are polling are customers of First National Bank, not necessarily people that don't have bank accounts, First State Bank customers, maybe people that don't have banks, whatever. So you're not getting a random sample. And then finally, the last step is contacting the respondents. There's many ways to do this, but the most common way is called telephone random digit dialing, which is basically you hook up a bank of telephones to a computer, and it randomly spits out telephone numbers from the area in which you are trying to poll. Three things necessary to believe a public opinion poll. I touched on one of them. You must see the sampling error. If you don't see a sampling error, plus or minus 2%, plus or minus 3%, when they show you the poll results, then it was not a legitimate poll. They did not do it scientifically. You must see the exact wording of the question, because you have to judge for yourself whether it is a biased or unbiased question. Refer back to that the one on questions on the war. And then you must see the date or dates the poll was administered. People who aren't very honest will sometimes use old polls in their in their reporting, and so If you use old information or old polls, as we said before, people's opinions can change over time. So make sure it is recent, up to date, that that the poll was administered. And then finally, general influences on public opinion. What makes you think the way you do? And we're going to talk more about this in a minute when we talk about political socialization. But number one, uh, the biggest influence on public opinion is personal benefits. Does it help you? Does it make your life better? Does it improve your life? Do you see it as a positive good for you? Then that is the biggest influence on public opinion. We as humans and we as Americans generally support policies that help us, and we don't support policies that help other people and don't help us. It's a selfish gene we have, but it's human nature. We support policies that benefit us. We do not support policies that benefit other people and not us. So that's the number one influence on opinion. Next, political knowledge. How much knowledge do you have? What kind of knowledge is it? Is it a lot of knowledge and good knowledge? Is it a lot of knowledge and bad knowledge, misinformation? That influences public opinion. Lack of knowledge influences public opinion. Cues from leaders. Leaders include political leaders, uh, media leaders, talking heads that we like to watch on TV or listen to on the radio, constantly telling us what we should think and how we should vote and what we should believe. Oftentimes, many of us, we don't even think for ourselves with regard to whether we support a policy or not. We just wait for our favorite television or radio personality to tell us how to think. And this is dangerous, and it is lazy, and we need to do a lot better job as a society, you know, researching policies and how they impact society and ourselves, and not just going by what our favorite television or radio personalities tell us to think, because they don't necessarily have our best interest at heart. They're trying to do the number one thing that television and radio personalities do, and that is get ratings and make money. And then finally, political ideology is an influence on public opinion. Some people, I hear them all the time say, "Oh, that's a liberal policy, I'll never support it," or "That's a conservative policy, I'll never support it." Well, you're doing yourself a big disservice by thinking that way, because you can look back through American history, and there were plenty of conservative policies that worked, that helped, that solved a problem. And there are plenty of liberal policies that worked, that helped, that solved the problem. Nobody has a monopoly, liberals or conservatives, on successful policy. So when we limit ourselves by not even considering conservative or liberal policies, we're basically, you know, limiting ourselves to only half the potential solutions to the problem. Trying to figure out what works regardless of ideology is called pragmatism, being pragmatic. What's going to solve the problem? And that's the way in which we should really base our opinions, not basic whether it's one ideology or another.